my attempt at dramatic lighting. So
Excellent.
I was going to say that's like really good lighting. I couldn't tell if it was your camera or.
And you're supposed to just have the corner of this eye.
And I like the stroking the beard thing along
very
way.
good.
It's a good
I can't
effect.
grow a beard, but I'll just do this.
Yeah.
If no one thinks it's weird.
We'll all be in this together.
All right, let's do it. And we're live. It is Monday, November 30th, 2020. It is Cyber Monday, people. And I sincerely hope that you have spent an extravagant amount of money on Amazon today, because that is what you're supposed to do. Yesterday was, of course, Light Denim Sunday, and the day before that was Off Yellow Saturday. But today is Cyber Monday, so I hope you got off your computers in order to get back on your computers and buy things, because that's what we do the Monday after Thanksgiving, which is what distinguishes it from all other days. All right, I have a monologue today that is going to connect yesterday's show, which was about property rights, to the Michael Flynn pardon. And I know you don't think that property rights are connected to the Michael Flynn pardon, but they actually are. And if Michael Flynn's lawyer, Sidney Powell, knew this, she would be doing a better job representing her client than she is. Because I looked multiple times today at the Michael Flynn docket, and here is what I did not see. Any filing more recent than October 26th, 2020. That is more than a month ago. And here's the thing. If you are representing Michael Flynn and he has recently been pardoned by the president, and you have a case pending in front of him in which a judge could rule any day, you have got to file a motion to dismiss that case citing the pardon. And here is why. Because in 1833, Chief Justice John Marshall, wrote an opinion. John Roberts was not yet born, yet alone Chief Justice. But he wrote an opinion in which he made clear that the pardon, in order to be effectuated by a court, has to be pled. That is, the president could pardon you, but unless you took that pardon into court and waved it in a judge's face, it had no effect. And in fact, if you didn't do that, it was perfectly legal to execute you. That is the, if you have a pardon but you don't want to plead it, they can hang you. All right? The pardon is not self-executing. And what does he compare it to? A deed. It is a property right. He even says that this is like a deed or like a contract. It has to be argued to have effect. Which means, Sidney Powell, if you have a client who's facing sentencing in federal court and the president pardons him, you have got to go into court, wave that pardon in Judge Sullivan's face, and say, hey, dismiss this case because my guy's been pardoned. Or else, it is like you are claiming ownership of Kate's house, but you do not wave the deed in the face of the judge. You're just talking nonsense if you're too busy releasing the Kraken to waive the pardon in Judge Sullivan's face. So meanwhile, poor Judge Sullivan is sitting there reading the newspaper thinking, I wonder when somebody is going to come into my court, file a motion to dismiss and mention this pardon. But until then, I'm going to keep working on my 100-page devastating tome about the procedural history of this case. And that is what's happening right now, 5:06 p.m. I checked the docket probably about an hour and a half ago, and there was still no movement on it. I think what's going on is the pardon doesn't actually exist, but I'm not sure about that. It could be. There's another possibility that Sidney Powell is just too dumb to mention it. We're not allowed to have fun anymore. In lieu of fun, we have Alex Gibney here, and Alex Gibney is the maker of several of my favorite recent documentary films, as well as two that we're going to talk about today that I haven't even seen yet. Alex, welcome to In Lieu of Fun. How are you? I was going to say, how are you spending your time in lockdown, except that you seem to be spending your time making films about lockdown.
That's right. What better subject? Yeah, no, I've been busy.
So I have not yet seen this movie, which is called Totally Under Control. But I have heard a number of interviews with you about it and a bunch of stories about it. And I want to sort of get your account of, given that we're all stuck at home, and you're no less so than anybody else, and given that you're based in New York, probably more so than most people, at least for part of the time. How did you get the idea that we can make a documentary about this anyway?
Well, that's a good question. So let's set the Wayback Machine to March. And in March, things were looking pretty bad in New York and New Jersey. I had an office in New York and I live in New Jersey. And at that moment, I jumped on board one film by a friend of mine named Matt Heineman, who went in to the Northwell hospital system and was observing, the kind of chaos that was going on in healthcare there, up close and personal on a day-to-day basis. And it also occurred to me, as a friend of mine died from COVID, I believe it was in early April, that there was something terribly wrong about the federal response. So I thought it would be important to make a film about it. I wondered if anybody would be interested in watching a film about COVID during COVID, but it occurred to me that if I did this film fast and got it out in October, which is what I wanted, before the election, and if we would focus on the early days when things could have been different, if the federal government had done things differently, that might make an interesting film and it might be appealing to people. And I think actually it turned out pretty well.
So how do you do it? I mean, I forget which interview this was, but you describe basically shipping people cameras and having them point them at themselves. Talk about the logistics of this film. I've been in one of your films, and I know that you pay exquisite attention to setting up the shot. So for those who have never sat opposite Alex in a movie he's making, imagine, I don't think I'm exaggerating here, a dozen or 24 mirrors in back of you pointing at each other so that you're sitting there on a stool and there are kind of hundreds of you around, and Alex is filming.
Yeah, that was that was the wilderness of mirrors for the FBI Department of Justice doc that we did. So every film is different in terms of the formal conceit. And
okay, but every film there is a lot of attention to.
Yes.
Like, you're not doing what we're doing now, which is, you open your computer and like whatever the shot comes out. In Kate's head, it's got a puppet in back of it. In my case, it's got some cannons. In your case, it's got a dark wall. You're not doing that. You're paying a lot of attention to what the shot looks like. How do you do that when there's a pandemic and you can't be in the same room with people and your crew can't be there?
Well, we had two setups. One was called the COVID cam setup. And we wanted to embrace a kind of Zoom aesthetic so that we would have people looking into the camera, kind of like this, in a Zoom, but we wanted the image to be far more pleasing, well lit, and also, of high quality. So in the case of the COVID cam, we had one of my longtime associates, a guy named Ben Bloodwell, built a kit that we would send to the city of whoever we were interviewing. And it was basically a computer on top of which was mounted a DSLR, a sort of still camera that can shoot video, and a microphone. And we would get in touch with an assistant camera person in that city. They would get the camera in a Pelican case. They would carry it to the person's home, and they would place it outside their doorstep and turn it on and connect it to their internet. At that point, we were live. That meant Ben Bloodwell, who was in Philadelphia, could control the camera. He could control focus, he could control exposure. And so the person picks it up, lifts it, Ben suggests a place for him to put it down in his or her house, and then we're off and running. And so we can get a shot. And also, remember, this is a period, we started filming actually in April. No, it was in May. Started filming in May. This is a period where still people didn't know a lot about the virus. People were very concerned about contagion. And so this was a way we could get a camera to people without actually having any human interaction whatsoever. And it worked great. And there are a few interviews in the film that worked that way. And in many other cases, we had a setup where we would either Ben or another cinematographer would go into an Airbnb in the city that the person was located in. This all depended on one's risk, preference. If you're willing to come into a zone like that, Ben by himself would set up a camera with a big shield in front and a kind of, it's called an eye direct over the lens, which meant that we could project my image or the image of one of my co-directors, Ophelia Harutunian or Suzanne Hillinger, over the lens so that they're looking into the barrel of the lens, but they're seeing us. And Ben would be the only person in that place. He would scrub it. He was wearing an N95 as well as a face shield, all that. And then we would be able to conduct the interview that way. So it all depended on somebody's, risk tolerance. But that's how we had it set up. And we were shooting actually all over the world that way. Interestingly, we compared the situation in the US with South Korea. In South Korea, notably, we shot these shots of us shooting this material because we thought it'd be interesting for people. In South Korea, you can see a crew of 4 or 5 people because they, of course, had shut down the virus very early on, but not so in the United States. So that's how we did it. We also did go from time to time into some hospital settings where we're literally shooting kind of fly in the wall stuff. But in the main, we did the interviews in this kind of remote way.
So, with no disrespect to the project, we actually don't need a documentary to tell us that the COVID response was really fucked up. Like, it's nakedly obvious to anybody who compares the death numbers and the case incidence numbers between the United States and Germany, between the United States and Japan, between the United States and any large industrialized democracy that has anything like our standard of living and has a totally different, per capita death rate. So what is the movie adding to that knowledge in terms of, is it how we got to such a bad place? Is it the magnitude? What's the thing that the person doesn't know going in that they learn by watching the movie?
I think how is the operative phrase here, and the devil is in the details. In other words, how did we get it so wrong? Why was the federal response so bad? And also, there's a certain quality. We were able to get inside through the testimony of a couple of people. One was a guy named Rick Bright, who was a whistleblower, who had been the head of BARDA, and gave us a pretty extensive interview. And he's able to take us inside Health and Human Services and to show us some of the detail there. And one of the more illuminating interviews was given to us by somebody who had volunteered for Jared Kushner's task force, a kid named Max Kennedy Jr., who happens to be the grandson of Robert F. Kennedy. He was tapped by a former employer of his and said, do you want to help out on Jared Kushner's task force to try to get desperately needed PPE to Americans? He said, absolutely, 100%. So he goes down to Washington, joins 9 other volunteers ready to work 7 days a week, 18 hours a day to do whatever was necessary. They thought it was going to be data entry and running for coffee. Well, after a day in the FEMA offices, they discovered by their superior, who was a former assistant of Ivanka, that no, they weren't helping the task force. They were the task force. And they were supposed to use their personal laptops, their personal emails, their personal cell phones, and start Googling to see if they could find PPE in places like China. So that, if you get the detail of a story like that, you understand just how aggressively hostile to the enterprise of doing a good job was the Kushner task force, or for that matter, the Trump task force. But seeing the details like that was really instructive, and then also how the corruption operated, because he was part of this system where the federal government was subsidizing certain private companies and allowing them to profiteer on PPE once they started selling it to states, and the prices were going up and down like this. So I think for all sorts of reasons, it's really helpful to see. And you want to see, in terms of how we got the testing wrong, how we got the PPE wrong, how we got, and also maybe the other jaw-dropping thing about this episode was Trump was very fond of saying, Trump and the Trump administration was very fond of saying that there was no playbook. This was tabula rasa. We didn't know, how to handle something like this. I mean, not only was that a lie in one sense, because the Obama administration left a very healthy playbook for the Trump administration, but the Trump administration had actually conducted a very vigorous training exercise on how to handle pandemic called Crimson Contagion, and they did it in the fall of 2019. And they did a test for what you might do if a virus from, say, China, and China was the example they used, was to rock the country. And they figured out all the things they got wrong during that exercise and made a promise to stop them. It turns out if they had followed their own playbook, we wouldn't be in the soup that we're in now, but they didn't, because the reason why is maybe the big mystery, but they didn't even take their own playbook off the shelf, and their playbook was pretty robust. So there's details like that, I think, and I think it's also now, we've been so long in COVID, we're all exhausted by it. Some things have changed for the better. I mean, there are better treatment modalities and so forth and so on, but we focus pretty much on the first 3 months when really things could have been a lot different. We could have shut it down, and we didn't. And I think we didn't do it on purpose.
So I have all of these kind of interlocking questions. I'll try to untangle them a little bit. But one of them is kind of, in answer to Ben's question, I think, yes, we know now, like if the aim of your movie is limited, at least the cursory aim of the movie was to bring awareness about exactly what went wrong in fighting COVID in the US. Like, I actually see that, even if that was the main kind of let's get it out in October and like the main push for it, it seems to me that is far, like that is just completely overshadowed by the historical narrative and the journalistic narrative that you built out of something like that. Like exactly what you just described. Like no one for time in history, not even in terms of voting for the election, but in time in history would know how badly the task force performed without kind of seeing it for themselves and having, your cameras there. But that kind of brings me to a broader question of like the difference between doing like a retroactive documentary of something and and doing a documentary of something like at the exact same time that it's happening, and how different those two things are, and how hard it is to be able to tell a narrative or pull out a story like as things are happening in real time before you can have the perspective of even a few months of knowing what's going to happen or in the future. And so I guess I'm very curious about this. When you were doing this particular documentary, were there things that you kept in the final cut because you thought that they were going to be just very important for history to remember and know? Or was it really like in service of the bottom line to a certain extent of not just filming a pandemic or this pandemic, but like showing the world how badly the government had mismanaged a pandemic?
I mean, it was to show how badly, I mean, I didn't really know how badly the government had mismanaged the pandemic until I got into the film and started making it. Once you dig down into the details, you really understand it very carefully. And you're right, we were in the middle of the pandemic, even as we were shooting the film, and right on up to the very end. I mean, we finished the film. I finally went to bed, I remember, on a Thursday night thinking, wow, we got it done. And this would have been in September. And then the very next, and then at 2:00 that morning, early in the morning, the middle of the night, I get a call saying, oh, Trump's tested positive for COVID. So we had to open up at least that much to be able to include that, in the film. It
reminds me of
Susan
relevant. Hennessy in my book.
Yeah.
We put it to bed.
Yes, it's exactly like that.
We put it to bed. It's done. We're like, wow, very little has changed since we finished it. Every chapter is held up really well. It held up well against the Mueller report. Barely any changes from the Mueller report. We put it to bed. Boom. And the Ukraine scandal breaks. It was exactly that.
We had those same problems on Agents of Chaos. So yeah, it was a problem.
But then I'm thinking of Wiener, which which is one of my, I think, actually just like this meta piece of art. I like with the telling of his coming back from like this terrible scandal and starting his mayoral campaign in New York, and of course then like just in the most perfect like poetic type. I mean, like they managed to both like to document it all as it's happening and tell the entire story. I just kind of am so curious as to like what it was like to film something as it was happening, be part of it, versus like, I don't know, like I'm a huge fan of your Elizabeth Holmes documentary. I loved that. I thought it was just like so well done. And I'm just, but going back through that seems like a very different, creating that seems like a very different thing. Like as a process.
It was, because there was a little bit more distance in the rearview mirror. That said, even in that film, things happened along the way, and we discovered things along the way. I think in the case of Totally Under Control, we did have a focus from the get-go. We knew that we were going to focus on the first 3 months, and that at least was a kind of history. It was very recent history, but we were going to have to pick up along the way, because we were pretty certain that what we didn't want to do was just convey a kind of conveyor belt of events as they were happening, that we wanted to have some sense of focus. But there were things that thematically would pop up. For example, Woodward released the fact that, on February 7th, Trump told him in an interview that he knew how deadly was the disease. Well, that presented an interesting challenge and problem for us, because where do we put that in our narrative now? It's something that's happening right now in the moment, that is to say Woodward's revelation, but where do we put it in the context of our own film? And we actually put it at the end, but then rewound to the beginning, so it was clear, that it was a comment on what did the president know and when did he know it. So we were grappling with those issues throughout the context. The other thing we knew going in was that we were going to do a comparison with South Korea. It was very important to have some benchmark by which we could measure our own response. And so we did focus on that. And because both countries discovered their first COVID patient on the very same day, January 20th. That said, as we were rolling into the summer, Korea started to have another little spike. Now what we were going to do, how were we going to handle that? So these things always come up, but having some focus was really helpful in terms of getting us where we needed to go. Otherwise, we would have been lost.
So let's talk about Agents of Chaos, which I also have not yet seen. Although you and I consulted about it along the way a fair bit, as
yes.
did Javier, your fabulous producer.
And co-director of part 2 of Agents of Chaos.
And by the way, who filmed me in a compromising situation that I very much hope didn't end up in the film.
It didn't.
I was Alex's team came to film at Lawfare the day of the Jim Comey testimony, and I found myself at my computer quite choked up by the beginning of that testimony, and have lived in some fear that that was going to be in Alex's film ever since. This is, unlike the COVID response, a sprawling story, right? It covers an immense amount of ground. It covers a whole lot of stuff that isn't public. There's a lot of it that you can't film. How did you scope this project?
It's a good question. I mean, it was a weird process by which the project began, because I was contacted by a friend of mine that I might want to conduct an interview with somebody. He couldn't say exactly who it was. This is early in 2017. But would I conduct the interview anyway, just because we're good friends, and he assured me I would be interested. And that was an interview with Glenn Simpson. And Glenn Simpson wove a tale at that time that I began to investigate. And 4 years later, we finally finished the film. And it became 4 hours long. So it's hugely problematic. What do you leave in? What do you leave out? We focus very much on the period right up to the moment of the election, and maybe just after, and ultimately decided to separate the story roughly into 2 parts. Part 1 was mostly what happened over there, that is to say Ukraine and Russia, and we looked in detail. We got inside the IRA, we got inside the Evgeny Prigozhin operation. We looked at some of the cyber antecedents of this, how the investigation really began with a Pittsburgh investigation looking into a Russian hack into a Westinghouse nuclear power plant in Ukraine. I didn't expect to go there. So part 1 focuses on what, in the main, what happened over there. Part 2, in the main, focuses on what happens over here. In both sides, the agents of chaos we examine. And we were putting together a number of sort of unlikely bedfellows into a narrative. People like Felix Sater, Andy McCabe. We interviewed, oh my God, I can't remember. Who is the guy? I can't remember his name.
I'll help you.
Who is the guy that Carter Page? We interviewed Carter Page. We interviewed Andrew Weissman before he came out with his book. So and also a woman named Celeste Wallander and others. So we dug deep into what was going on this side to try to understand it from a different perspective. And I think we came out with a rather different point of view than many people. It was neither the Manchurian Candidate scenario, nor was it, it's all bullshit scenario. It was this idea that on this side, you had a chaos agent, which was Trump, who really wanted to make money, and was saying flattering things about Vladimir Putin because he wanted to build a Moscow Trump Tower, and right on up to the last moment didn't understand or believe that he was going to win the election. At the same time, the Russians were playing games to enhance the magnitude of the chaos that he was causing. So anyway, it was a big, long, sprawling project. And
who did you fall in love with as you worked on it?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I actually really dug Celeste Wallander. I also love this woman, Camille Francois. Do you know who she is?
I know.
Yes.
We have had Camille on in lieu of fun, in fact.
Yes. So she's
here
great.
just a few months ago on my deck having drinks. She's amazing.
Yeah. She's lovely. She's
very smart.
Very smart, very knowledgeable. She helped us hugely in terms of part 1, the Russia what happened over there, breaking down the IRA, the social media, all of that. And she was just fantastic. I actually love talking to Felix Sater.
Yeah, he's a fascinating guy.
Really a fascinating character, because I think he was put over to the sideline. If you spend time with Felix Sater, you understand his story a lot better, I think, than you might otherwise do. I love talking to Andrew Weissman. Andrew Weissman was, it was sort of old home week, because I knew him from a film I did early on called Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, because he used to be part of the Enron task force.
He ran
the
Enron
task
great.
force. So there were a lot of interesting characters.
You have like so many films that you've done. I've like, just looking at your IMDb, I'm just like in awe of like all of the things that you've done just in the last like 10 years. Like, and Enron wasn't even 10 years ago. You did that in 2005.
Did the Lance Armstrong film.
I know.
The Scientology film and the
WikiLeaks film.
Yeah, well, the WikiLeaks film is...
The WikiLeaks film is great.
We Steal Secrets is one of the best documentaries made about espionage at all. And the fact that you were so honest about going in as a kind of acolyte of Julian Assange and growing increasingly appalled over the course of the film gives it an amazing trajectory. All right.
Can I ask really quickly? Like, yeah, I'm just really fascinated.
Wait, Kate, should I bring in the audience questions while you're asking this, or do you have more?
I have I will try to like control myself and not take all of the time for my own questions, but I'm just super fascinated by, there's something very compelling about the visual, like video and in general as like in the law and cognitively as kind of like, if people believe video in a way they do not believe like text that they read or even necessarily photos that they see. And this is, there's various kinds of examples of this, and it's been tested and everything else. But what I'm so interested in is like, what kind of drew you to that as a medium? And then like, it's not as if you just have one thing or one topic like politics that you spend all your time like doing a documentary about. Like you've gone WikiLeaks, like business, WikiLeaks, fake news, agents, all of these I think that the Elizabeth Holmes, sports, music, everything. So like I just feel like you find, in my impression, is that you see something that's like interesting, a person that would just be fascinating to put under a microscope and go from there. But what's been your experience with all of that?
I mean, I think that when my dad always wanted me to follow him into the family business, which was print journalism. But in the late 70s, which is when I graduated from college, film to me was a much more powerful medium in terms of reaching people. And there was a certain poetry to it that I really liked. And I ended up over time, and it took a long time, because if you actually look at that IMDb page, seemingly there's a lot of missing years. I
wasn't going to ask.
And I was trying to find my way. And ultimately, I think part of what got me to an interesting place was combining sort of a rigor of investigative journalism with a kind of filmmaking passion, which is more than, trying to make films like movies, but at the same time, having a kind of investigative, bent. The other person I bumped into along my path to becoming a filmmaker was a guy named David Halberstam, who's a pal of mine. And David had a great tradition of doing a big book. And David always spoke in a very low voice. My dad used to say he was like the perfect person to broadcast the end of the world. But what David used to do was he'd alternate one of his big books with a sports book. And that's a way of keeping you sane, but also keeping you in touch with things in a way that is powerful. So I move around a lot. Now, it turns out, without me thinking about it too much, that I do get drawn back to similar themes, things like noble cause corruption, self-deception, deception. These things come in over and over and over again. But I kind of stumbled into that without knowing as much about it as I would have thought. So sometimes a film will come to me because somebody will offer it to me. Sometimes I stumble upon something and think I want to go there. But having a kind of sense of curiosity is hugely helpful.
So our first question comes from James Puckett, who for some reason I have been unable to bring on screen. But he writes, Mr. Gibney, is there a documentary about a specific American political event or political campaign you would like to make in the future? Going Clear is one of my favorite documentaries of all time, by the way.
It's a good question. Thank you for the note about Going Clear. I'll have to think about it. I mean, it's one of those things where I don't know. I don't know yet.
But you don't have like a stored list of
not really. I mean, there's a
the
few
Millard Fillmore.
There's a few
campaign.
Stories I'm interested in. I'm always interested in corruption, and I'm doing quite a big series now about the opioid crisis, but looking at it not as a crisis but as a crime, and it's a pretty big crime. And that one, I think, is turning my crank at the moment.
I just want to observe to the audience right now that 100% of our questions are from men. Tony Cava, the floor is yours.
Sorry, every once in a while we have to try to get some people, new voices into the mix.
I have no problem with always taking a question from Tony Cava, David Botts, and Daniel Burge. But no, John Bordeaux, there are no women to upvote in the ask a question thing. There are literally no women who Oblio 23 purports to be female, or at least not male.
Well, just not a man. So
yes. So we
anyways.
We're going to bring Oblio 23 on momentarily. Tony, the floor is yours.
In the meantime, do you want me to get my wife? She might have a question.
No, but you can get your dog. Say hi to Momo for me.
We don't
Momo,
coerce anybody to appear on In Lieu of Fun.
You don't. Mr. Gibney, I had not realized I'd seen so much of your work until I heard you guys were listing it off. So my question is about, I'll just make an observation that Trump didn't get rich turning down the opportunity to grift. And we have a lot of evidence of GOP senators manipulating their stock positions to maximize their profits post-pandemic, based upon the news they had. So my question to you is, to what extent do you think the U.S. pandemic response was retarded or delayed, stunted by efforts by Trump and or the Trump family to kind of maximize profit, to charge rent off of the pandemic, and PPE profits or testing profits, vaccine profits. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. If we started investigating the Trump family post inauguration, what might we find if we looked into that?
I heard rumors, and we looked into some of it in terms of connections to Trump himself and the Trump family. We weren't able to prove any of them decisively, so we didn't include any of them in the film. It wouldn't surprise me, but I don't think it would have been a motivator from the get-go in terms of how the response was managed. But there was a kind of crony capitalism involved in all of the responses to COVID, which I find, absolutely appalling in its rapaciousness. I mean, and I mentioned, the Kushner task force, which was one, but also the way that they enabled companies to profiteer on the COVID crisis in ways that I also find appalling. But I think that the simple goal early on was that Trump didn't want to be bothered with COVID, because he had an election that was coming up, and he just thought if he ignored it, everything would work out fine. And and that I think is a crime. I mean, it's a crime of kind of titanic proportions in terms of the number of lives that have been lost as a result of a kind of off-the-cuff political calculation, which turned out, as it happened, to be hugely wrong.
And do you think, I mean, just to like, what do you think the best case scenario is if you'd done everything right in the United States? We're a lot bigger than South Korea. We have a lot more ports of entry. We're a lot bigger than Taiwan and Australia. So we're quite a bit bigger than Germany. So if you'd done everything right in the United States, we do have divided sovereignty. There's federal authorities that don't exist. What do you think the percentage is that's worse than it needed to be? Is this like we could have been South Korea realistically, or is this like we could have been Germany or France, right? Which is bad, but at a per capita level, a third as bad, half as bad as the United States.
I mean, I don't know if we could have been South Korea, but look, let's also say, I mean, South Korea is a lot smaller, but it's still a country of 51 million people.
Yeah.
And intense urban concentration. And at the end of the day, they lost about 500 people up till now. That's pretty staggering. I think, we had certain advantages that even places like France and Germany didn't have. We had a robust pandemic plan. We had, until it was utterly politicized, the Centers for Disease Control. We have a fantastic, bench of pandemic and epidemiological experts. So I think if we had invested in them and worked hard at containment early on, so much of this could have been managed. And, because early on, in early January, people were saying, we got to gear up with PPE. We got to gear up for our testing capacity. We have to think about how we're going to contact trace. But none of that was followed up on. And as a result, now there were some legitimate mistakes made, not legitimate, but sadly terrible mistakes made in the testing process by the CDC, but no federal guidance or leadership because the federal government, in this case, didn't really care about government and wasn't particularly interested in it. So honestly, I think we could have been a lot closer to South Korea than we think. And people like to draw cultural comparisons and so forth and so on. I think what distinguished South Korea from the United States was that they learned from their previous pandemic. They learned from
I was
MERS.
just going to say that. Yeah.
And they took
And
it
SARS.
on board. Yeah, and SARS. So that they were able to have a very robust response. 7 days after they discovered their first COVID patient, they have a fully engaged plan with government and industry to pump out a testing and tracing program. So I think we could have practiced containment as opposed to mitigation, which would have been a huge game changer in this country.
Okay, correcting my error from before, Oblio, who is apparently female, whose webcam is off, but who should be audible. The floor is yours, and apologies for misgendering you.
My Oblio icon is probably counterintuitive.
It's also
So
too
my
small for me to
question is-
discern.
Okay. Anyway, my question was, how far into your latest documentary was it when you realized that the pandemic response failure that it was intentional?
I think we came to that. We finished in September, and by late August, I was pretty certain it was intentional. It took that long to kind of come to grips with that. The thing that nailed it for me was, honestly, the proof that was in the proof to me was that Woodward revelation. When you hear Trump say that he knew how deadly it was on February 7th, that's before any Americans have died, then you're dealing with a degree of intentionality that is kind of mind-boggling.
But let's talk about that, because I have found, I try never to think about Trump's motivations except when I have to for reasons of, scienter requirements in criminal law. But because I just don't like spending time in his head. But all right, let's say you're Donald Trump and in January what he says to Woodward, which is this is going to be bad. Why do you make the judgment better to deny it publicly and be made to look like a fool than to get down and dirty with response? And, maybe you don't do a good job, but at least you're seen trying in an active way. Like, when you say it was intentional, why do you think in his head that is a reasonable strategic judgment, leaving the morality of it completely aside?
I think he's possessed of a certain magical thinking. In other words, he really thought that if you don't pay that much attention to it, if you don't focus on it, the economy will continue to grow, my popularity will continue to grow. And after all, it's just a disease. Diseases happen. I'm not in his head either, and thank God I'm not. But I don't think he saw the future properly. Just as, he kept trying to separate the economy from the disease. If you got the disease right, there wouldn't have been that kind of economic destruction that we had. So I think, because early on, you see him, in some ways, Trump is very transparent in the sense that he will often say what it is exactly that he's going to do. And he was talking about, the ship that was anchored, off the coast, and saying, I want them to stay on the ship because if they come on land, the numbers are going to go up, and I don't want the numbers to go up. For anybody who has the remotest amount of respect for the CDC or epidemiologists, or, it's like the numbers are already going up. And not to mention, he has certain political instincts, like shutting down Chinese nationals returning from China, coming from China to the United States. He kept, that's in my view, that was his version of build a wall, right?
Right.
It sounds good, but COVID doesn't care whether you're attached to a Chinese national or an American coming back to this country. They're happy to take a ride on the plane nonetheless. And we didn't prohibit Americans, as we shouldn't have, but we certainly didn't test them when they got back here. So the disease was spreading long before, he didn't want to pay attention. And so he didn't.
I mean, I'm not going to say this, like, this isn't in his defense, obviously, but I do think I understand a certain amount. And it goes to what you were saying before, Alex, about SARS and MERS and the kind of cultural difference. We did ignore SARS and MERS for the most part when they happened in China and in parts of Asia. And they were very much felt and were covered in the newspapers as diseases that were happening in Asia, not things that we needed to worry about here. And when the first things that were coming out were that this was, and I was actually just reading the New York Times coverage of this province in Italy that was just horribly hit by the disease. And one of the reasons was because none of the people who were contracting the disease at the very earliest stages in the hospitals were eligible for testing because none of them had any connection to China. And that was one of the necessary requirements to getting a test. And that was in Italy. And so my only, I do think that for a split second, that kind of denialist approach made sense. It's just that he never rethinks or recalibrates in light of new information. He just continues forward and just kind of once he has made up a decision, just trumpets it and sticks to it. And so that to me is I could kind of imagine that seeming like a rational take in his mind to not treat it not treat it like it was a disease and it was despite everything everyone was saying. It was not rational is how he failed to update his priors as everything around him very rapidly kind of unfolded.
I take your point to a certain extent, but I would push back a little bit in the sense that you're president of the United States, you have resources. So there appears to be some kind of coronavirus in China. So who do you talk to, or who do you have Alex Azar talk to? Maybe you go over to the CDC and ask them some questions. What should we do? Have we prepared for this in case things get really bad? Give me a report. You know, you'd think that would be.
No, totally.
And so it's this total distrust of expertise. I mean, in the Trump White House, they referred to the CDC as the deep state.
You know,
so depressing.
So accurate. When I think about, like, you just missed it in your Agents of Chaos movie,
right,
that the real deep state is those biomedical research types.
That's right. That's right.
I'm a kid of two of them. So, you know, the deep state is the NIH campus. Daniel Bird, the floor is yours. And I'm pleased to see you're back in your native habitat with your camouflage.
So I'm curious, what do you think motivates people to believe these conspiracy theories that COVID is some kind of hoax? And do you think there's an explanation beyond the fact that some people are just not very smart?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated answer, and it's not going to be true for half the people I'm thinking about. I mean, I think it's a combination of things, and people are always asking this question. Partially, I think it's tribalism. In other words, part of Trump's appeal to a lot of his followers is, you understand me, we understand each other. So if Trump says we're going to be fine, then we're going to be fine. And by the way, these people in these blue states are trying to crack down on our freedoms. So we can't allow them to crack down on our freedoms. And it becomes a kind of belief system. I mean, I did a film about the Church of Scientology, and the subhead of the film of Going Clear was the prison of belief. Well, if you believe it's so, it's so. And, you know, I get into exchanges on Twitter all the time with people who believe that there was nothing that could be done, that wearing masks is stupid, and you know, shit happens and people are going to die. I don't know what you say to that, except it is appalling when you have a political figure who encourages that kind of behavior.
Yes.
Because the one thing that he is a genius at is stirring emotions in people, particularly emotions of anger and vitriol, and that, I think, you know. He is enormously talented at doing that.
Yeah.
David Botts.
Mr. Gibney.
Oh, nice addition of the monolith.
That mysterious monolith.
Nice.
Plants. We got monoliths.
Plants.
We got orbs.
You got an orb.
Orbs?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about all of these.
I think Room Raider should really be asked to weigh in on this.
I agree. I'm going to do it right now. Go ahead. The floor
right,
is yours, David.
Thank you.
Let's give a good picture of David for.
There we go.
Nice.
So, Mr. Gibney, thank you very much for your efforts on the film. It was both informative and shocking. I will tell you, I was angry, and I just got more and more mad the more I watched it. It just angered up the blood. As the film was being produced, did you feel like you were observing like a slow motion car wreck that could not be stopped? And a couple of details that I'm interested in. Michael Bowen, the CEO of Prestige Ameritech, sounded the alarm and predicted the mask shortage perfectly. But do you know, has anybody paid him to make masks, which he offered to do?
He is making masks now, but I mean, the problem was, you know, it's always behind the curve, right? And precisely what the Trump administration did do for some of the vaccine producers, they didn't do for mass production, which is to guarantee a federal contract so that you could be assured that if you were starting to produce masks, you know, in case the situation got really bad, that you would be compensated for it, that you weren't just taking a flyer. And that's what didn't happen.
So on this point, just how important guaranteed contracting is. My grandfather, who was a chemist, insisted he lived to be 97, and he was an explosives chemist during World War II, which was a group of people who were so valuable that they were not drafted, and so he, to his dying day, would always maintain that the thing that separated him from all other men of his generation was not having had the experience of service in World War II. But he also claimed quite preposterously that the thing that materially changed the United States in its attitude toward Jews was cost plus contracting during the war. And the reason was, in his account, was that before the war, you could always just decide you didn't want to hire Jews. But during the war, you actually were, the government was backstopping whatever investment you put in. And so if you discriminated against people, you were giving up money, because whatever they produced, whatever they cost, the government was going to fund, and whatever they produced, you were going to get X on top of. And his contention, and I've never researched this, was that discrimination in employment against Jews went down dramatically during World War II and never went back up after it, and that you can attribute it really directly to cost plus contracting. I have no idea whether that's true, but Amos Turk believed that very, very deeply. Tim Smith, you get the last question today.
Hi, I was wondering if you had any further thoughts on one of your older films, Client Number 9. I know from my perspective, your film back 10 years ago was the first time I found out who Roger Stone was, someone who I think everyone in Lieu of Fun knows very well. And I guess following up, do you feel the lawlessness of the Trump era, including that of Roger Stone, makes the political and prosecutorial reaction to what Spitzer and Emperor's Club did way back when now seem even more unjust in time?
I mean, it's hard to know. I mean, it's a complicated question. What happened to Spitzer? I mean, Spitzer did something for which he prosecuted other people, and I think he fell on the sword of hypocrisy. And he was, interestingly, the Department of Justice didn't prosecute him; they outed him to the New York Times, which was their way of getting him out of office. But you have to admit that Spitzer failed in some fundamental way. He knew enemies were coming after him, and he did the very thing that he prosecuted others for doing. That said, I mean, one of the things that I think about in terms of that film, having spent a good bit of time with Roger Stone during the making of that film, and it's really rare you get everybody to come on board in that film. But Spitzer was on board, Roger Stone was on board, Hank Greenberg was on board. The escort came on board. I mean, everybody was on board. So, but I always saw Roger as this kind of jokester, trickster who would always exist on the periphery of the political system. It never occurred to me that he would actually move to the center. And that was maybe
like
the
a leech.
shocking
Then all of a sudden he's like, ugh, the thing that the leech is on, or I don't know. Not
I did find it. I remember going to drinks with Roger one time, and what I found interesting was if you would ask him a question and he would start to respond, and his response was about to be a truthful response, I sensed. But it was clear that responding truthfully was so boring to him that he just stopped right away and then would begin to tell the most elaborate lie, because it was the only way that he found that he could amuse himself. The truth was of absolutely no interest in him whatsoever.
I
All
have
right.
one last question before Ben wraps. You can't pick your own movies, but what is your favorite documentary, or the one that you kind of aspire to that like inspires you?
The one that inspires me, I'll pick two that really inspired me. And one was Gimme Shelter by the Maysles Brothers. And the other one is The Sorrow and the Pity by Marcel Ophuls. So between those two films, you kind of get where my crank is turned.
I have just almost finished watching a documentary called "Don't Fuck with Cats,"
Good title.
which is
That's pretty great.
I actually recommend. It is a film about a group of internet investigators who stalk a serial killer because he
That sounds awesome.
because he suffocates two kittens in a video on the internet, and they go after him, and he turns out to be a really, really bad guy. It's a pretty interesting movie. I am in arrears, however, on watching Alex Gibney films, so I am going to watch these two over the next week or so. Alex, you're a great American. It is great to see you again, and I'm glad you not only have you have not merely not been attacked by COVID, but you have attacked it as you have. Kate,
Thank you so much, Alex. It was great to meet you.
Kate, great to meet you. And Ben, always a pleasure.
Who is our guest tomorrow, Kate?
I don't know. You didn't put it in the calendar.
Yeah,
and
I didn't
you were
put them in
you.
Our
who-
guest.
Which
Our guests tomorrow is the estimable Kate Bond, I believe.
Oh yeah.
Sarah Bond. Sorry, I was looking at Kate, so it came out Kate. The classicist, I believe. Although I have to go back and check my correspondence to figure out who I scheduled for when. But in any event, that will be 22 hours and 57 minutes from now. And until then, we don't have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we can send people camera kits in boxes and make documentaries almost as though we could have fun. Alex, it's great to see you. And let's do it again soon.
Absolutely.
So much
Great to
fun.
see you
Thank
both.
you.
All right.